Hi, and welcome to another JavaScript mastery video. The current situation in the world is not great, but what can we as developers do to make it better? Well, one thing that we can do is we can take an API which just has a lot of data and then we can visualize it to help spreading the awareness. This is just my take of taking one API and then visualizing the data. We're going to explore the data of the API in just a minute. In here, you can see that we have the number of infected people, number of recovered people, and as well as the number of deaths. This chart contains a lot of data, but if we didn't create a chart, if we just had the raw data, that would be an array of, let's say, some objects with the numbers, that would be unreadable to any human being. But taking the data and making sense of it, it's the best thing that we can do in this scenario. So you can see, we can visualize the number of infected people, we can see the exponential growth, and then we can take action. The second thing that this COVID-19 tracker or statistics app have is the choosing of the countries. So we can choose a specific country and get the data for it. Let's see, let's try with, for example, Australia. For specific countries, the API unfortunately doesn't provide the historic daily data. The only thing that we get is the current final stats. So as you can see them right here. And then we can make that into a nice bar chart to visualize it. Let's see for a few more countries. Let's see Bangladesh. Okay, a great number of recovered people in Bangladesh. Let's take a few more at random. And I would like to show you China. China is the country with the highest number of recovered people, and that's good. We can see that the things are slowly getting better. Okay, let's go back to the global chart one more time to see it. And in case you missed it, you can see that we have a slight animation on the counting numbers right here. So that's also a great thing that we are going to implement. This is the finished product. If you stay watching this video until the end, you're going to learn how to create this completely by yourself. How to do this counting numbers, how to do this cards, how to do this country picker, and how to do the charts as well. And of course, this is all responsive. So if we open the console and open the mobile device, you can see it's fully responsive, both for mobile devices and for tablets. So that's good. Without further ado, let's dive right in. As always, we are starting with the empty Visual Studio Code window. The first thing that you can do is create an empty folder. You can call it Corona app, Corona tracker, something like that, and you can just drag and drop it into this window. Secondly, we are going to go right there into view, and then we are going to open a terminal. You can click it right there and it should open. After that is ready, we can run npx create react app and then just type /. This is going to initialize an empty React application in the folder that we're currently in. And then you can just press enter. The API is going to be down in the description, so while this is installing, you can open it, and in the browser, you can take a look at what is it offering. Let's take a look together. And this is it. If you just follow and click the URL in the description, then you should be greeted with these values. Possibly it's going to look like this for you, which isn't going to be meaningful. But if that's the case, then you can install a simple Chrome extension called JSON Formatter. And that simply parses the data for you, so you can see it in a more, let's say, valuable format. Now that you have that installed, let's see what data do we have. So we have the number of confirmed cases right here, confirmed, and then a value. The same things goes for the recovered and the deaths. And this is global data, of course. Then we have the daily summary. So we get all the daily data. And then we also have daily time series, which is just going to be data for a specific day taken into different chunks. But we are not going to need that for our API. Then we get the image, which is going to be already pre-generated image of the current time, which is really cool. But we're going to build this chart ourselves, so we're not going to need that picture. Okay, so let's collapse this one more time and see what else do we have. We have the source. We need to link it, of course, to credit the author of this awesome API. Below, we have the details for all countries. This API gives you just the data for all different countries, so you can make a list and then you can make the user select from a selector. And then below we have the specific country. For example, we have the USA, and then we get the current data for that country as well as the time of the last update. This API has everything that we're going to need. And of course, as always on JavaScript Mastery, we are going to code this in the most efficient way possible. In React, we are going to have just one single class-based component. All other components are going to be functional components with hooks. We are also going to have a specific folder structure for all the components and the API fetching itself. Everything is going to be nicely styled, up to date, and using the best practices. Now that this is installed, what I like to usually do is I like to delete this src folder and create it from scratch, because we don't need a lot of the things that Create React Apps gives us. So in there, we of course need the index.js as well as the app.js. These are the main files. Inside of the index.js, of course, we need import React from React, and only in the index.js file, we need import React DOM from React-DOM. Inside of here, we can also import app from /app, and now we can call that React DOM .render method on it, and the first parameter that it accepts is the app component, and the second parameter is the element we want to render it on. So that's going to be document that get element by ID, and then the root. For the beginners watching, why are we getting this and how are we getting it? You can go inside of the public, and inside of here you have the basic index.html file, nothing special in it. And you can see that the only thing that we have inside the body is just a basic empty div with an ID of root. Okay, now that that is done, we can go into the app.js and create a basic class-based component. So import React from React. And in here, we can say class app extends React that component. Of course, in there we have the render, and we also have the return, which for now can only say, let's say div, and then we can give it an h1, and inside of there we can say app, just like that. And then we need to export it. So export default app. Before we finally start our React application, let's install all the necessary dependencies so that we don't have to later. You can do npm install --save, and then let's list all of them. So first one is going to be the Axios. With the help of Axios, we'll make GET requests to the API. The second one is React-Chart.js-2. This is one of the better libraries for making charts. Then we have React-Count-Up. This is going to help us make that animation while counting numbers. And let's see whether we need something else. That should be it. If I miss something, we're going to install it later. When you run that, you can just wait a bit and it is going to install all the necessary dependencies. And now we should be good to go. You can go ahead and run npm start, and that should start your React application on port localhost 3000. And as we expected, we get an h1 that says app. Now let's implement some more JSX. We're going to first do the project structure. So we're going to create a components folder, components, and then inside of there, we're going to create all the folders that we're going to need and all the components so that we can just put them here inside of the app. And then later, it's going to make things much easier so we can just focus on creating special components. We are going to stick to a really good project structure, so you can go ahead into the components and create a new folder. That new folder is going to be called cards with a capital C, cards. Then you can also create a new one called chart. And finally, you can create a folder called country picker. Great. With this project structure, each folder is going to have its own styles and its own component. So inside of the cards, we can go ahead and create a cards.jsx file, as well as the cards.module.css. It's really important to use modules in React. If we don't use CSS modules, then all the styles from here would be applied over all components, and that can lead to interference and unpredictable code. We don't want that. So we want this file, this CSS file, to belong only to the cards.jsx, and we can do that with using modules. Okay, now we're going to create the same thing for each one of these. So we're going to say chart.jsx as well as the chart.module.css, and final one is going to be the country picker.jsx as well as the country picker.module.css. Okay, great. Now inside of the cards, let's create a basic functional component. So import React from React, and we can also do const cards, which is going to be a functional component. And inside of there, for now, we're just going to return an h1 that says cards, just like that. And of course, export default cards. Just to save some time, I'm going to copy this and paste it across all of these different components. So charts, but the only thing that I'm going to change is going to be the thing right there. So instead of cards, I'm going to say chart. And finally, the same thing here, but instead of cards, it's going to be country picker. Great. And now we can close all of these files and let's import them inside of the app so we can see them nicely. We would need to do something like this. Import cards from, and then /components/cards, and then /cards. And we need to do this for each component. So cards, this is going to be chart, and finally, we need to have a country picker. Right now, I'm going to show you a neat little trick. We don't need to have imports like this. As you can see, there's a lot of repetitive code. We are many times specifying where do we want to import from, what do we want to import, and then imagine if you had 6, 9, 12 different components. It would just clutter up your app.js, right? So what we can do is we can have just one import file, like this. Import, and then in here as named imports or named exports, we can put cards, chart, and the country picker from /components. That would be great, wouldn't it? And now we can just keep on adding different components, but right now this wouldn't work. So what do we need to do to make it work? Well, we need to go inside of the components and just create one index.js file, index.js. This file is going to take all the components, cards, charts, country picker, and so on, and it's going to export it from the components folder. So what do we need to say in there? Bear with me, the syntax is a bit weird, but mostly I just copy and paste this. So export default as, and then we have cards. So default as cards, the name of the component, from /cards/cards. Okay. And we copy this and do it the same thing for two other components. So chart, and then finally country picker. Okay, with this in place, if we now go back in the app, in here we have no error, and these components are indeed imported like this. So we just have the name of the components, and they're coming from the components folder, because indeed in there we have the index which is exporting them. And this makes our code much more readable. Now let's use these components. So inside of here, we are going to say cards. Then we are going to have chart. And finally, we are going to have country picker. Or rather, country picker is going to be above the chart. Okay, great. What else do we need? We can also apply some styles to the app.js. So I'm going to go ahead and say import styles from /app.module.css. This file doesn't exist yet, but let's create it. So right there in the src, I'm going to create a new file called app.module.css, and inside of there we can just apply some container styles and stuff like that. Right now I just gave it a background color, so to the whole app let's just give it a slight background color, which is going to be RGB, and then 250, 250, 250. So it's almost white, but it's barely visible, it's grayish. Then we can specify a container, And it's going to be just a simple flex container, which is going to have align items of center, and of course the justify content of center, like this. That's all that we need for now. So if we go back into the app.js, and now the body is being applied immediately, but inside of here we can say class name. And if you never worked with this modules, it's a great practice, you really should enforce that. But if you never worked with that, you usually did something like container, and that would immediately be applied. In this way, you just have to put this as dynamic and then say styles.container. And this makes sure that you don't have any interference with any other CSS files across your whole file system. Great. So now that we save that, we can go and take a look how the app looks right now. Nothing special, right? But it's great that we already have our components in there. Now we can actually focus on implementing the logic rather than always worrying about the project structure. I usually prefer working with functional components with hooks, but whenever a component gets too complicated, I just switch back to the class. There's so many benefits to functional components and hooks, and we should all use them. But whenever we are dealing with some asynchronous data and stuff like that with multiple use effects that we would have using the hooks, it's just a bit easier to bring it back to the class-based component. So all the other components are going to be functional with hooks, but just the app is going to be class-based just because it's easier. Right now, we can focus on the biggest part, which is creating the API calls. So inside of the SRC, we're going to create a new folder called API. And then inside of there, we are just going to have one index.js file, index.js. Great. And now inside of here, we can make functions that are going to fetch some data that we need. So of course, we need to first import Axios from Axios. Axios is used to make API requests. And then we need the URL of the API. It's going to be like this. I'm going to paste it into the description so you can as well copy it if you want to play with it yourself. So the first thing that we're going to have in here is going to be a function called fetch data. So fetch data, and it's going to be an arrow function just like this. Inside of here, we are going to have an asynchronous function. And we are going to use the most modern way to deal with asynchronous data, and that is async await. It deals with promises in the same way that .then and .catch does, but it's much easier to both read and write. So inside of here, we are going to have a try and catch block. Try is going to be executed if the fetch is successful, and otherwise we are going to get to the catch block. So inside of here, we can get the data. So let's first get the response from the await, and then axios.get, and then we just get the URL. And we can just do console.log response to see what do we get back and what data can we play with. Of course, we need to call this function. Currently, we are not using it, as you can see right there, so we can export it. So export const fetch data, and with that out of the way, rather than console logging the response, we can return it. So let's return response. And now we can call this function inside of the app.js. So we have the fetch data function, which is an asynchronous function returning a response from the API. To call the function, we first need to import it. So that's going to be import, and then curly braces, because it's a named import, fetch data from /, and that's going to be API, and that's it. Whenever you have index files, you don't need to specify index. It's just like that. So you can just say the folder name. It immediately goes to search for index file. Okay, great. And now what is the best place to fetch the data inside of the class-based component, let's say? Well, in the component did mount. So in here, we can say component did mount, and inside of there, we can make the request to the fetch data. So let's say const data is equal to await. Of course, we need to await because we are dealing with asynchronous functions, and we are going to await the data that is going to be returned from our function. But for this to work, the await needs to be wrapped in a function that is asynchronous. So how do we make a component did mount asynchronous? Usually you put just the async keyword in front of the function, but with the component did mount, it's special, you just put it in front of it. So it's built in asynchronous component did mount. And finally, in here we can do console.log and see what the data is. Now, if we go back into our browser and if we didn't mess up anything, you can go into the inspect and then the console, and we should be able to see our data. And we do. I'm going to make it a bit larger for you. So that's the object that we get back. We get the data, we get the status text, headers, config, but we are not worried about any of these. We just need raw data. So in here, that's inside of the data object. Confirmed, recovered, that's daily summary, daily time series. We have everything in there. So one thing that I would like to do right now is just take the things that we need. We are not going to need all of this. We are not going to need daily time series. I noticed there's a lot of empty ones, so it's zeros. They don't have a lot of data. So we can just focus on main ones, confirmed, recovered, that's daily summary or something like that. So we can go back inside of the API and configure this response however we want. So the first thing that we can do is we can just get the data. So that would be something like response.data. There is an easier way to do this, and that's with destructuring. So we can destructure the data from the response. We get it like that. And now we don't want to return the response. We just want to return, let's call it modified data, const modified data, and that's going to be an object. And in here, we're going to take only the parts of data that we need. And in some different API calls, which we are going to create just below, we are going to fetch some other data. But for here, we're just going to need confirmed, and then recovered, that's, and the last update. So how do we populate this? Well, we just put the data and then data.confirmed. That should be it. And then we can do data.recovered, data.that's, and then we finally have data.last update, of course with commas afterwards. And then finally we can return just the modified data. There's an even easier way to do this. As we destructure data, we can destructure all of these properties from the data. We just do that by putting another colon and then another square brackets. Inside of there, we can say, what do we want to destructure? Well, confirmed, recovered, that's, and then the last update. So we destructured everything in here. Let me make it a bit bigger for you to see. Right there. Okay, and now we don't have to specify and repeat ourselves and say data every time. We can just have it like this. But this is not all. The JavaScript objects work in a way if the value and the key have the same name. If you omit the latter, so if you omit the value, it's immediately taken. As you can see, right now it is being used since this is yellow. If we remove this or put it like this, let's see, confirmed. Yeah, you can see now it is not highlighted. So confirmed is declared, but the value is never read. So if we bring it back to confirmed, you can see it's used again. But if we just remove everything, you can see it's also used. So you can have it like this. It's a syntax that's a lot easier to read and write. And since this is an easy object right now, we can just have it in one line. Also, we just create it here and immediately use it down there. So we can just take the value and immediately return it without having to store it in another object. That's it. Now, if we go back into the app.js, we are getting the data and console logging the data again. Let's see what do we get back. As you can see, now we get the object with only the data that we need. Confirmed, recovered, that's, and last update. That's great. So now, what do we want to do with this data? We are not going to display it in the app.js because in here we have special components for all that. We are going to want to display it in the cards. So how can we bring the data from this little scope of the component did mount? How can we bring it to the cards? What do you think? What we can do is we can set it to the state. So we can say state. And in last video, many people asked, why didn't I declare a constructor? It's completely okay to declare a constructor, but React team decided that it's a lot of unnecessary code, and if you just write it like this, the constructor is going to be immediately constructed in the backend, although we cannot see it, but you can just declare the state like this. It's a bit easier to, again, read and write. So if we have it like this, what are we going to have in the state? Well, we can create an object called data. And at the beginning, that data is going to be just an empty object until it is populated. We can populate that data in here. Set_state, of course. And then inside of there, we set data to be equal to data. Of course, we can remove the latter one, but what I prefer is actually having them both, because with set states, it's just easier to see what do we set. So we can call this fetched data. Makes a bit more sense, and then put it right there. Great. Now that we have that data, we can pass it as props to our cards component. So we can say data is equal to, and then we can either say this.state.data, but the better way is to destructure it at the top. So in here, we can say const, and then take the data outside of this.state. And then we can just say data. Now we can go into our cards component, and in there we can see what data do we get in here through props. So inside of here, let's just console log the data so we can see what are we getting. You can see we are getting two different data objects. First one is going to be empty because data is not fetched already. The cards are going to be three little containers or cards that show the number of infected people, the number of recovered people, and the number of deaths. You can see them right there. So how do we do that? In this project, I use Material UI. It's going to help us with mobile responsiveness, and it's going to help us with not having to do so much CSS ourselves. We're just going to use Material UI components. So I completely forgot. You can go ahead and open the view and then the terminal one more time so we can install the Material UI. Again, with the Control-C, you can stop the current application from running, and then you can run npm install --save, and that's going to be at material-ui and then /core. You can install that, and you will see we'll be able to use a lot of different components from that. If you never use Material UI, you can see right there, React components for faster and easier web development, build your own design system, or start with Material Design. It's like Bootstrap, but it's more sophisticated and it's better suited towards React. In here, we'll get a lot of different components. So we can, for example, go right there, components. And the one component that we're going to use for cards is going to be this card little thing right there. As you can see, we would have to worry about a lot of code of creating this card with CSS and HTML, or JSX rather. But with the Material UI, we can easily get this card out of the box. We just have to use the card component. So if you take a look right there, we need to import the card, and then this is what we will be using. Okay, but now we're going to implement that from scratch using Material UI. Now that this is installed, we can again run the npm start and close the terminal. It's going to be left running. And now we can implement our cards. We're going to first import something from Material UI, and that something is going to be card content, typography, and finally grid. So these are the things that we'll be using from Material UI for creating these cards. So we import that from, and then we say at Material UI /core. Great. So the first thing that we can do is we can wrap this into a container. So we're going to have a div, which is going to have a class that's going to be equal to container. Class name is equal to styles.container. And we forgot to import the styles. So in here, I'm going to say import styles from /, and then remember what we have, cards.module.css. Of course, we need to create this styles for container. It doesn't exist yet, but let's first create basic JSX structure. Inside of there, we are going to have a grid that's going to be a type of container. So we need to have one grid that wraps all the other cards, right? This grid is going to have a property of container, and then also a spacing equal to 3. It's just going to space out cards, and we can give it a property called justify of center, which is going to just justify the content center for all the items inside of it. Then we can have one specific grid item, so grid with the type of item, and then inside of there the component for that item is going to be card. So card component is going to be our grid, so we can style them nicely, and is going to get that card paper-like look, like it's hovering over the browser. Great. Then we can apply some styles, but we can leave that for later. Inside of the card, we are going to have card content. And inside of there, we are going to have typography. Typography in Material UI is used for texts. So it can be paragraph, it can be heading. It's just more styled than the basic heading or paragraph that you can have. So we're going to say color is going to be equal to text secondary. And then we are going to have gutter bottom, which is just going to provide it a nice padding on the bottom. And our typography is going to say infected. So the first card is going to be for infected people. Then we're going to have yet another typography below. This typography is going to have a variant of H5. So it's going to represent an H5. And inside of here, we are going to have the data. So I'm going to say real data. Of course, we are going to have to fetch this from API, but we already have it in the props. We're just going to wait a bit and do the structure and then implement the real data. Below that, we are going to have another typography. And this one is as well going to have a color of text secondary. And it's simply going to say the date. So how are we going to get the date? Of course, we are going to fetch that from the API. So real date, we are going to leave that for later. And then we're going to have just one more typography in here. Bear with me. This typography is going to have a variant of body2. That's the Material UI variant. And then it's going to say anything that we want it to, but it can say number of active cases of COVID and then 19. That's it. This represents our one card, and let's save it and see whether we have any issues. And we indeed do get our real card in here. It has real data, real date, but it doesn't look so nice just next to this country picker in the chart. We need to fix this. But for now, let's just add two other different cards. It's going to be for the number of recovered people and the number of deaths. We can grab this grid. Don't take the container. We can just grab the inner one, the grid of item, and we can paste it right here 2 more times. At the end of this video, maybe we are going to refactor this by creating a dynamic map, just so we don't have to 3 times have the same things, right? This is not good. For the second card, we are going to have recovered. In here, we can put number of recoveries from COVID-19, and this can be deaths and the number of deaths, let's say, caused by COVID-19. Okay, let's save it and see how it looks. Okay, we do get 3 cards. Doesn't look so nice yet, but we are going to add some styles and implement that. Doesn't look so nice yet, but first let's catch the real data and then we are going to style it. For the last time, let's see how our props look like and let's take data from them. So if we open the inspector and then the console, we should be able to see the object that we get. In here, we get the data object. Inside of there, we get the confirmed, but we need to go one level deeper to get the value of confirmed. Of course, we are going to destructure this. So we are going to take confirmed as well as the recovered and the deaths. Of course, we need to take last update, I think. Let me see. Last update. Yeah, last update as well. Confirmed, recover, and deaths are still not real values. We need to say confirmed, and then we need to say that value. This is going to give us the real value of confirmed cases. If we save that and go back, oh, you'll be greeted with a nice little error. It says cannot read property value of undefined. So how to read that error? Cannot read property value, okay, that's okay, of undefined. That means that the confirmed was undefined. So how can we check whether the data was not yet fetched? Do you remember when we first console logged the props? You could see that the first time the object was undefined, and then only the second time it was fulfilled. So in here we can just add an if statement and say if there is no data that confirmed. So if it doesn't exist. Of course, if there is no confirmed, there's also not going to be recovered or debts. So we can say if no data that confirmed. We don't have data here, we destructured that, so we can just put confirmed. And if no confirmed, then we are going to say return and then loading, just like this. And then just below we have our normal return. So let's go back and see whether that works. Okay, you can see loading right here, but we are not getting the data, which is interesting. Let's try to debug it. Let's do console.log right there, and let's try to console log the confirmed. Okay, first we get undefined, and then the second time we get undefined. And that was my bad. We don't have these as props. If you go back into the app.js, you can see that we passed only one prop, and that prop is the data. So first we need to destructure the data and then destructure all of these things outside of the data. So it looks something like this. We first have our destructuring of the data and then another destructuring of all of these things. So if we save that and now go back, we should indeed see loading, and then this is the number of infected people. But we said that there is going to be a counter, so the numbers are going to move. So how can we implement that? Well, if you remember, at the beginning, we installed a dependency called count up, and we installed it from React and then dash count up. So we can use that component and it's going to make wonders for us. And in here, we're going to replace the value with a component called count up. And that count up is going to be a self-closing component, and it's going to have a few different properties. First one is going to be a start. It's going to start from 0. So we can just say start is going to be equal to 0. The second thing it needs is going to be the end. And the end is going to be the value that we used just now, which is confirmed that value, just like that. And then we also can specify a few more things. We can set the duration. For example, 2.5 seconds is okay. And then the last thing that we can do is specify the separator. The separator is used to specify how do we want to separate our number. Since the numbers of infected people are large, we can add a comma in between. And this is our component. If we now go back and check it out, and you can see the numbers started from 0 and are now loading. That's great. So now that we know what goes inside of here, we can also collapse that into one row and we can leave it like this. So this typography has a bit more characters, so we can leave it in a new line. Great. In here, we get the real date, but where is it coming from? From last update, right? We destructured that from the data coming right here. So if we say last data and then just try to use that, let's see what's going to happen. Okay, we get this weird format, but how to make it a normal human readable format? In here, we can make a new date from that. So we're creating a new date object, and then we need to call that toDate string. If we call that toDate string on a new date object, it's going to return it in a human readable format. So if you go back, you can see Thursday, April 2nd of 2020. That's great. And the numbers are loading. So we have the first card up and running besides the styles. But let's first do the data for all the other two components. So I'm going to copy this typography, which contains the count up, and then I'm going to replace it with here. So we can just replace the real thing. Okay, real data. And then the typography for the date is going to be the same. So I can just replace it right here and right here. But of course, we don't want confirmed here. We want the recovered. And then in here, we are going to have that's just like that. Let's save it and go back to see how it looks. Okay, loading, and then the numbers are loading. Okay, we have that, and now let's apply some styles. So we imported the styles from styles, but now let's add them. We have the container. We are also going to have styles for each one of these cards, and we're not only going to have one style, we're going to have multiple styles for each grid. So the styles are going to be as follows: class name. And now this is the question: how we do multiple styles with using the module.css. We cannot do something like styles that test and then styles that test one. This is not going to work. This is not proper syntax. Well, you might think putting it in an array is going to make things work, but again, this is not going to work. So what can we do? There is an external module called class names, and we can import it. The practice is just to call it CX, so like class names, I guess, from class names, like this, all lowercase. And now, instead of having it like this in an array, we can just do CX and then put that as a function call. That's a method. And this links our classes together, and now we can apply multiple classes. So each card is going to have a styles of card, and then it is going to have a class name of either infected, recovered, or deaths. So in here, we can put infected. One last thing that we have to add to this grid item is going to be the size for mobile devices. So on mobile devices, that's going to be the screen extra small. We want this to take all 12 spaces of the width. So we want it to take a full width of the screen. But on medium and upper devices, we want it to take only 3 spaces out of 12. And we are going to copy this now and paste it for each specific grid card. Right there, grid card. And the only thing that we have to replace is going to be infected with recovered. And then finally, the infected with deaths. Just like that. Now we can go back to our CSS. First thing that we can do in here is the container. So that container, before I meant to do like display flex, but it looks like we only need a margin 50 pixels on top and bottom and 0 pixels on left and right. And then for each card, we want to give it a margin on left and right. So that's going to be 0 top and bottom and 2% on left and right. Since we are dealing with Material UI and we are setting the styles like this, we are going to need to use that important. That's important to make this work. With Material UI, you sometimes need to do it if you are not doing inline styles. Okay, and now we are going to add a specific class for each of the, let's say, class categories. So it's going to be infected. It's going to be border bottom, 10 pixel solid, and then we are going to say RGBA. This last one is for opacity, and it's going to be 0, 0, 255. This is the pure blue color, and then we are going to give it a 0.5 opacity. It's just going to tone it down a bit. Now we are going to copy this and paste it 2 more times. One time it is going to be for recovered, and one time for deaths. And we're just going to change this. So we're going to have blue for infected, green, which is here. We're going to have green for recovered, and then the red for deaths. So just like this, and then 255. That's it. That's all that we need for now. And if we go back, you can see, if you refresh, the cards look great, the count up is working, and that's it for the cards. Of course, we need to style this with the country picker and the chart. Chart is going to be a really interesting part. I think that's the part that we can move on next. For the chart to work, we need a second part of our API. So we're going to close everything and just have the API ready. In here, just below, we are going to have a second function that's going to be export const, and then we're going to call it fetch daily data, because we need the daily data for the chart. Of course, it's also going to be an asynchronous function, and inside of there, we can also put a try and catch block. Before, I did this with .then and .catch, and it's so much easier to do it with async await. So I'm really glad that I can show you. In here, we're going to have the same thing as we did before. So const response, and then that's going to be equal to await axios.get, and then we need to specify the URL. We have the URL here, but it's not only that, we are going to get the second part of the URL. So we can make a template string like this, and it's going to be /daily. This is where we will get our daily data from. We get the response. From the response, we can destructure the data. And then finally, we get almost the same things back, but this is going to be in an array. So let's go to console log it. In here, console log the data. To be able to see this console log, of course, we need to call the function. We are going to call it inside of the chart, right? That's where we should actually get the data. So inside of here, we first need to import React as well as the use state and the use effect hook, because in here we are going to be using hooks. So use state and use effect. Inside of here, we can specify the state. The state is going to be daily data. And then the second part, set daily data. So once we fetch the data, we are going to set it to the state using hooks. Equals to use that state. And in here, you provide the initial value, which is going to be again an empty object. So this is how use state works. Maybe some of you didn't encounter that before. In here, we get the state field. It's the same as we had something like state is equal to daily data. And then we have an empty object. So this would be the representation of this in a class-based component. But in here, we immediately get the setter method for it. We don't have to worry with this.setState. Okay. And now just below, we are going to have use effect method, which accepts a callback. So you can have use effect and then a callback down there. In here, we are going to encounter a problem that I mentioned earlier. Again, use effects with asynchronous functions are a bit hard to read. So we cannot make it something like this. Async use effect doesn't exist. And in here, as you can see, the React even gives us a message. Effect callbacks are synchronous to prevent race conditions. Put the async function inside. So we cannot do this. We need to create a new function. So const, for example, fetch data or fetch daily data. We cannot call it like that because we are going to have to import the API. So let's do that. Import and then a named import fetch daily data from // and then // API. Okay, and then we can call this, for example, fetch API is going to be equal to an arrow function, async 1, of course. So in here, we can use async capabilities. In here, we can immediately do const daily data, which is going to be equal to await, and then we need to fetch the daily data. Of course, the return of this function is going to be a promise because it's asynchronous. And then with the await keyword, we wait for it and then put it in a variable. We don't even have to put it in a variable. We can immediately call our set daily data and then pass whatever's in there to that set daily data. This means that we have daily data populated right here, and we need to call the fetch API function like this. Of course, we can make this a self-calling function, but this is also okay. Now the daily data is populated, but we are never using it. So where are we going to use that daily data? We're going to have two different charts. So I'm going to create a constant for each one of them. We can have bar chart, which we are going to have later for each specific country, but our line chart is going to be the one responsible for the global showing of the data. It's even better because we have the daily data only at the global scale. So to make this work, we need to import the line chart from the React Charts API. So import, then line. We can do the bar while we are here from React Charts.js 2. It's the second version. And while we are here, we can also import the styles from /chart.module.css. That's it. I don't think we need anything else. Great. Now in here, in the line chart, we can use that specific chart. So how is this line chart going to work? Well, it is a component we imported from the React Chart.js. The only parameter that we need is going to be data. We do this to make it dynamic, but we add another pair to make it an object. So the data is going to be an object. It's going to have a few properties: labels, which we are going to leave an empty string for now, and also data sets, which are going to be an array of objects. So we're going to have two different objects. Now we need to input all of this data, and that can get complicated. So let's start piece by piece. First of all, at the beginning, the same thing as before. When the things initially load, we are not going to have data initially loaded. So what we can do is we can say if daily data, and then the first thing, so that's going to be the first day, is available, then we are actually going to return that line chart. But if we don't have the first day of the daily data available, that means that none of the days are available and the data is not fetched yet. In that case, we are going to return null. Now, after we call this fetch API, we can do that right here. Let's console log the daily data. And we should be able to see what do we have in there. Okay, I just noticed that in here we have the data, which is correct, but in the API we have fetch daily date. That should be data. So great for you if you noticed that thing. Let's go back and check whether this works now. I noticed this little error right there, and that means that for the React Chart.js to work, we also need to have Charts.js installed. So you can open the terminal and then we can install npm install --save chart.js. After we install this, this is going to make sure that our charts can run. So this is just a React wrapper for Charts.js, but to make this work, we need to have Chart.js installed as well. Okay, great. So now that this gets completed, we should be able to see our daily data. Okay, that's it. And then we can run npm start and again close this terminal and wait for the browser to load our daily data. Okay, we have some errors, but the most important part is that this works. We indeed do get a console log that contains 71 past days of data. The things that we're going to need from here are going to be total confirmed, and then we have, of course, deaths and recovered people. So that's great. Now we can use this daily data in this chart. So we just need to pass it in here, and I'm just going to show you the way how you can do it. So let's first do the labels. The labels and the datasets needs to be an array. So let's first get all the dates from the daily data and display them as labels. So inside of here, we can loop through the daily data. In here, we can immediately just destructure the date and then simply return that specific date. Return date. Now this is a map and returns an array of all of the dates. Let's see if that brings us something or we still have an error. Okay, we still have an error. We're going to worry about that later, but right now, let's first do the datasets. Datasets are the most important part, so let's first do them. You may be wondering, why do we have two datasets and not three? So for infected people, for recovered people, and for deaths. Unfortunately, the API doesn't provide daily data for recovered people. It only provides the confirmed and the deaths. That's unfortunate, but we need to do what we can use from the API. So in here, we are going to have the data, and that's going to be pretty much the same thing right there, but we are not going to use the date. Rather, we are going to get the confirmed. The second thing that we need is the label. It's just simply going to say infected. Also, we need a border color, which we can specify with, let's say, hexadecimal value. I found that 3333 and FF works really well. And then we can say fill true, which is just going to fill the space below that chart. Great. And now we can do the second thing. We can copy this data set right there and replace the empty object. And now, other than confirmed, we are going to have deaths. So in here we have deaths. The border color is going to be red, and we are also going to give it a background color, which is going to be an RGBA, the same one that we used with the card of deaths. So it's going to be an RGBA with 255.00 and then of course 0.5. So that's just going to show the area below the border color. That's going to be background color, like that. Now our line chart is done and we can display it right there. So instead of the chart, we're going to have, let's say, a div. Yeah, we're going to have a div, and that div is going to have a class name of, you guessed it, container. So styles.container, and just below that, in here, we can put our chart, just like this. And in here, we can display our chart. That's going to be line chart, the only chart that we have for now. We are also going to create a bar chart. I guess something is still broken, so we need to go in the browser and check that out. Cannot read property 0 of undefined in the line chart. So daily data 0 is undefined. That means that in here we have some problems. So let's one more time console log the daily data. I really like doing this debugging slide so I can show you how to solve the issue yourself. Okay, let's refresh and see what we get. You can see right here that we get an empty object, and of course we cannot get 0 property of an empty object. Daily data is an array. We saw that before. We are looping through it. So inside of here, it would be more correct to put an empty array. And then that is going to enable us to more easily test if there are no values. Now, instead of this, we can just check daily data dot length, since it is an array, is not equal to 0. If it is not equal to 0, that means that there is something inside of there, and then we can represent a chart. We can even make this shorter by using truthy and falsy values. We can leave only this. Why is that so? Well, if the length is 0, so if the array is empty, it's going to be 0, which is by default falsy. And if it has any other number of elements like 3, 5, 71, it's going to be truthy, and then this is going to show, which is great. So now let's save. After a bit of debugging, I just found out that our console logs, which seem to be populated with data, weren't coming from here. They were coming from here. Instead of returning the data, all this time we just console logged it, and we don't want to do that. We saw that with the data there are a lot of stuff. So in here we have total confirmed, mainline China, other locations, all the other stuff. We just want confirmed and then the deaths and the date. That's it. That's all that we need. We can go back in here and we can do really similar thing to the one that we did right there. We can get only the data that we need and only return that data. But in this case, the data is an array, so we need to loop over it. So let's say, for example, const modified data is going to be equal to data.map. So we want to map over it. We're going to have daily data inside of here. And for each one of these, we're going to return an object. So how do we do an instant return of an object? We first put parentheses and then an object, like that. So whatever is in here, we are returning as an object. We want to have confirmed, which we are going to set to daily data that confirmed that total. We are also going to have deaths, which is going to be equal to deaths that daily data that deaths that total, like that. And then the date, which is going to be equal to daily data that report date. That's it, like that. And now we have the modified data, and we don't want to console log it as we did before. We want to return it. Return modified data, just like this. Now it is going to be right there. It is going to be fetched. When initially it is fetched, it's going to be 0. This check is going to make sure not to load the chart without any data. And then if there is data, this chart is going to be loaded. Let's go back and see whether that works. It looks like we are still getting some errors. Daily data is not a function. Let's see what's happening in here. And I just noticed the daily data needs to be a map. So daily data is not a function. It's not a method. We need to say daily data.map to map over it. Okay, now with that out of the way, if we save it and go back, let's see. Okay, we finally get our chart. It's right there. And if we save that and go back, you can see the chart right now. It's small, it's on the side, we need to make it in the middle and much bigger, but that's it, we get the data. So let's immediately place it in the middle and give it some size so that we can see how well the data is really showed with the chart. The only thing we need to do to fix that is go into the app.module.css and then add flex direction of column. That's going to put it immediately below the cards, as you can see right there. And now we just need to make it bigger. So inside of the chart, did we import styles? We did. And now we just need to add the styles. So inside of here, we just need that container and display flex, justify content center, and finally width of 85% of the whole screen. This is going to fix our width. And that's it. Now we have the cards, you can see them right there, they're styled, and these numbers are incremented as soon as you load the page. Just below that, we have the country picker component, which we didn't implement yet. And then finally, we have the chart. The chart was initially just an array with 71 elements, but in here, we nicely visualized it. You can see the exponential curve and unfortunately, the number of deaths as well. That's it. Now we can focus on making the country picker work and making the bar chart for each specific country. Let's focus on making the country picker. So we can go inside of the country picker component and we are no longer going to have just this simple H1 right there. In this component, we are also going to use both use state and use effect hooks. Just like that. And also we need to import some stuff from Material UI. That something is going to be native select, which is going to enable us to select a country, and then the form control. Just like that. And then from, again, add Material UI core, just like that. Great. Now, inside of here, let's use these components we imported from Material UI. First, we are going to have a form control, just like that. And inside of there, we are going to have a native select, like this. And then inside of the native select, there go different options. So let's say we have our first option, which is going to be global with a value of global. So this is a blueprint of how our options should be. But then again, we are not going to have 100 or 1000 different options for each country, right? No, we are going to fetch them from the API and then we are going to loop over them. But for now, let's just add the classes to the form control. Class name equals to, let's say, styles.form control. And that would be it for styling. We just need to import styles from / and then, as always, country picker.module.css. And now we'll be good to go to fetch the countries from the API. Well, how does that need to look? What do we need to get? Let's go back into our API and we're going to see that right now. It's not going to be complicated. Below export const fetch daily data, we are going to have export const and then countries. That's going to be, again, an async function. And it's going to have a try and catch block. So try, catch. In here, we can just do console log error. I forgot to put that in there. As we always do in the try block, we are going to have a const of response, which is going to be equal to await and then axios.get. And in here, we need to specify the URL. Again, it's going to be a template string that's going to say URL, but it's going to be / countries. Just like that. Now let's see what are we going to get back from that. So console log response. Of course, we need to call it somewhere. So now we are exporting it. Let's go into our country picker and let's actually call it. So we need to import it. Import countries from / API. If I'm not mistaken, that should be it. And now, again, we are going to have use effect, which takes in a callback. Inside of there, we need to create an asynchronous function, const fetch countries, for example, async function. Inside of here, we can wait for these countries, but we are not just going to set them to a variable. We are going to set them to the state. So inside of here, we need to say const, and we can call it fetched countries. And of course, set fetched countries. That's going to be equal to use state with an array right there, because the countries are going to be an array. So right now we can finally do set fetched countries. And what is this going to be equal to? Well, await countries. This whole time, we still didn't see the console log coming from right here, from the API. So we can finally call this function, fetch countries, just like this. And there's only one thing that we need to do. Inside of here, we need to provide a second parameter to the use effect. It says, if present, use effect will only activate if the values in the list change. So initially without this, this would just run endlessly. But if we put set fetch countries in here, it is going to change only when set fetch countries change. That's going to enable us to pick different countries. With that out of the way, we can go to our index.js and we can go to the browser to see what the response is. In here, we get the data with the status, headers, config, but again, we just need the data. Inside of the data, we have the countries. In here, that's an array of 181 country in an array. And for each country, we have the full name, ISO2 name with 2 characters, and ISO3 name with 3 characters. The only thing that we are going to want from all of this is just an array of countries with a full name. So in the API, let's do just that. In here, we have the response, but of course, we are going to destructure the data out of it, and then we are going to destructure countries out of the data. Then we can map over those countries, so return countries.map, and for each country, let's just close this properly, we just want to return its name. So we don't need ISO2 and ISO3, so just return country.name for each specific country. Before we go out and check how the data looks like, I just noticed a little error. We have fetch daily data, we have fetch data, and all of these are asynchronous functions. This is an asynchronous function as well. So let's call it like so, fetch countries. And immediately, if we go back to the country picker, you're going to notice an error. This indeed needs to be called as a function. So in here, we're going to call it properly, fetch countries. And just like that, we are going to call it. But these two functions cannot have the same name because this would be calling itself. So we're going to change the name of the outer function to fetch API, just like that. With that out of the way, let's finally console log the fetched countries, which are now in the state right here. Okay, if we go back, as you can see right there, we have an array of 181 country with just the country names exactly as we need them. Now we're going to loop over them and create a picker for each one. Just below this option, we're going to create 181 more options. We're going to do that dynamically by mapping over the fetched countries. So fetched countries, that map. In here, we get the country. And then for each country, we are going to want to create an option. That option is going to say country. So it's going to be the name of the country. Also, it's going to have a value of that same thing. So it's also going to have a value of country. And there is a React rule that we also need to provide it a key whenever we are mapping over something in React. And that key is going to be equal to I, which is just going to be index. We get that index right here as a second parameter to the map. And with that out of the way, if we now remove this console log and go back, we should see a picker with all different countries. And as you can see right here, the options are here. We just populated 181 option in one single line. That's great. We won't be keeping the state of the chosen country in the country picker. Rather, that's going to be in its parent component, the app.js. To make that work, we need to go inside of the app.js, and then in here, we need to add a country, which is at the beginning going to be an empty string right there. Now we need to create a method that is going to change the state of that country. So in here, we are going to call it handle country change, which is again going to be an async function. It is going to take in one parameter, which is going to be country, of course. And inside of there, we are simply going to, well, at least for now, set the state, right? So we are going to first fetch the data and then set the state. But let's first try to get this country to here. So console log country. How do we do that? Well, we are going to pass this method as a prop to the country picker, just like this. So country picker, and then it's going to be equal to handle country change, but we need to add this in front. Now our country picker can make use of that coming through props. So in here, we are going to immediately destructure it, handle country change, and then on change on the country picker, we are going to set that as the parameter of that function, or as an argument rather. We are going to have a default value, which is going to be equal to empty string, of course. And then we are going to add that specific onChange handler. In there, we always have a callback function, which of course has an event. And then we just want to call this function coming from the props, handle country change, and then we want to pass whatever the event is equal to. So the data, the chosen country, and the data for the country chosen is inside of the event, that target, that value. I just noticed I have a big typo right there. It's just handle country change, which is equal to this that handle country change. If we go back and now, for example, choose Andorra, we indeed do get that printed out. That's great because we have that in the app. In the app, we can now make additional requests. We are going to want to call the API and we need to pass that specific country. So we still need to make that part of the API work. We need to go back into the API, and that's going to be in the same call as we have it right there, this fetch data. But how are we going to make it dynamic? So first of all, we need to create something called, let's say, changeable URL right there. And we are going to set it equal to the URL at the beginning, but then we need to change it. So we know now that this fetch data is going to receive one parameter, which is going to be country. And we are going to see that right here in the app, because we are going to want to call the same fetch data in the same way we called it in the component did mount initially. We want to call it right there, but this time we want to pass the country. That's why we needed to set this parameter of country right there. And now we're going to see what do we need to do with this changeable URL. So if there is a country, so if it is full, we are going to set the changeable URL to be equal to, and now we're going to build the URL. That goes URL / countries, the same as we had right there below. But this time we need to populate it with one more thing, and you guessed it, that's the country. Great. The thing that we get back from this is going to be the same thing that we need to get back for this. It's going to be completely the same, but this time we're going to pass the changeable URL instead of the URL. So if we are calling this without any parameters, without the country initially, as we are calling it right here, then the country is going to be equal to undefined. That's falsy, and we are going to call it with the same initial API. But if there is a country, then we are going to change this URL. We are going to populate the country, and then this data is going to correspond to that specific country. In here, we can again add console log error if there is one. So now let's go back to the app.js and console log that data. So console log fetched data. Great, let's see whether we are getting any. And then we can set it to the state, of course. So if we go back, okay, we don't get anything because we didn't choose anything. Now, if we choose, for example, let's say Belgium, we indeed do get an array of values for that specific country. Of course, it needs to be reflected right here and right here in the chart. That's the exact reason why we needed to have the country in the state of the app, because app is the parent component of both cards, country picker, and the chart. Now we can pass that specific country to each one of these, to the chart, to the cards, and so on. Now that we've gotten that fetch data, we can do the same thing. We can set it to the state. Of course, you can see this code is repetitive, so at the end of this video, we may clean this up. We just make an external function and then call it on the component didMount and on the handle counter change. Great. So now our data is going to be inside of this data, but we need to update the country as well. So in here, we are going to add country is going to be equal to country that we are fetching right there from this parameter. Great. Now, where do we want to pass the data? Well, the data is updated and it is actually being passed in real time in here in the cards. We are already passing data. That initial data is the same data as the data for each specific country. So possibly this will work right now if we just save it and go back. Right now we have the global data right here, and if we change for Angola, for example, that data indeed gets reflected. Bahamas, that's it, our cards work. Now, of course, we need to pass the data to the chart as well. So data, we can also pass the country so that we know for which country is the data for. Great. Of course, we need to destructure this from the state. So in here, we're going to have country. Of course, that's coming from the state. Now we can go back to the chart, and that's going to be the final part of this video. We need to create the bar chart that's going to show final data or the current data for a specific country. In here, in the props of the chart, we are getting the data and the country. So that's great. Again, in here we have the daily data. That's only for the global chart. But for the bar chart, we are going to use this data right here. So let's create our bar chart. It's going to be the same as the line chart. So const bar chart. And then it's going to be equal to some JSX. Again, we need to have one checked. So we are going to say if data.confirmed. So if the data exists, then we are going to show the bar chart. So in here we have the bar chart. And if it doesn't exist, we are going to return null. That's it. Now we need to input all the data for our bar chart. It's going to be a bit different from the line chart. So the thing that it needs is, of course, the data. That's one property, which again, we have double square brackets, one for making the code dynamic and the second one for opening an object. And the second thing is going to be options. Options is again going to be equal to the object. In options, we are going to have legend, and that's going to be equal to an object with display equal to false. We don't want to display a legend. We are not creating a map. And then we can have the title, which is going to have the display of true, and it's going to have a text of a template string, which is going to be equal to current state in. And then in here, we get our country, which is coming from the props, of course. Great. Now let's provide that data. We are going to first have the labels. In here, we can make static labels. We know that there's going to be only 3 columns. So we can have infected, recovered, and deaths, just like that. And then we have our data sets. We're going to have an array of only one object, which is going to be our single data set. And inside of there, we're going to have a label. It's going to say, for example, people, so the number of people. It's going to have a background color, which is going to be an array. So in here, we need to specify a background color for each one of these: infected, recovered, and deaths. That's going to be the same thing that we had in the cards. So if you go into the cards module, we have this RGBA blue, RGBA green, and then RGBA red. So we're going to copy all of these and just paste them right there into the chart, but we need to make them strings. So we are going to have this one, and then these two as well, but we need to make them strings. So just like these. That's it. We got our background colors, and the most important part is the data. So comma, data, and the data is again equal to an array. Inside of that array, we are getting the data. The data is coming right there from the props. We are passing it right here on line 7 for me. And it's coming from data.confirmed, data.recovered, and data.that's. We are going to destructure these, so we don't need this data right here, nor here, nor here, and we also don't need it here. We just want to check for confirmed. Now, from the data that we are getting in here, in the props, we can destructure that, and we can take confirmed, that's, and the recovered. That's it. Now, our bar chart is not being used anywhere. So how are we going to display bar chart if there is a country chosen, and a normal chart, a line chart, if no country is chosen? We can just make it ternary. So we can say, if there is a country, then show the bar chart, otherwise show a line chart. That's it. Now, if we go back, okay, I need to spell this correctly. So bar chart, great. If we go back, now we should be able to see our global charts right here. And if we choose a country, we can see our bar chart, but the data is not being properly displayed. So let's see what's wrong with that. The first thing that we can do is we can console log the confirmed, as well as the recovered and the that's. So let's do that to make sure that we are properly getting them right here. If we do that, we can notice a huge flaw in our application, and you can see we are constantly getting more and more and more requests, and that's one little mistake right here. So in the use effect, we are going to put an empty array. This makes the use effect behave like a component did mount, so it only happens once. Otherwise, it was just going and going and going endlessly, which was making our application slow. Right now, we get it only once. So right here and right here for the updated one. Now let's choose a country. So let's go for Australia. And we indeed do get values, but they are nested in an object with the property of value. So that's where our numbers are. So right there, we have to go in here and we need to say that value for each one of these. Just like that. We can now test it out. If we go back, you can see that we indeed do get the global chart and the global numbers. But as soon as we change the country, for example, to Argentina, you can see our numbers are being populated and our bar chart is being generated. That's great. Right now, we need to add only a few more styles, a few finishing touches. We need to add an image right there, and we need to make it mobile responsive. Let's see how it looks right now. Since we are using Material UI, it already looks really good. We specified that each card is going to take full width on mobile devices. So that's exactly what happens. But we are just going to add a few more finishing touches. Let's start doing that right now. First thing that I notice is that we didn't add any styles to the country picker. So we can do that right now. We just need to set this form control. Form control, we are going to give it a width of 30% and also a margin bottom of 30 pixels. And we need to say important because we are adding this on a form control element, and unfortunately we are not styling this inline, so we need to specify it. Okay, in the country picker, do we indeed have that style right there? We do. That's going to be it regarding that. Let's see if we need to add some other classes in the app itself. So inside of the app.js or app.css, we need to add that image. So let's do that right now. I'm going to create images folder in the src. So new folder, images, and then I'm going to drag and drop the image we're going to use. I'm going to leave the link in the description so you can use it as well. We cannot see it right here, but you're going to see it when we render it. So let's add an image. First in here, we're going to use an image, But what is the SRC going to be? So with React, we need to import all of our images, and we know that it is in the images folder. So we can do just one thing, import, and then we can call it, for example, Corona image from .images/image.png. At least that's how it's called for me. And then in the SRC of that image, we can simply provide that path and our image should be showing. Let's just add a few styles. So we're going to say class name is going to be equal to styles.image. And it says that we need to provide an L tag. That's for screen readers. We're going to say COVID-19. Just like that. Now we are ready to go providing the image some styles. We need to go to the app.module.css. We are going to target that image. So that image with lowercase letters, and it's going to have a width of 370 pixels as well as the margin top of 50 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Looks like I have one small typo right there, images and then image.png. If we go back, we should indeed see the image, and here it is. Okay, now we could also make this a bit more responsive. So I'm going to add a media query. So media, and let's say just max width of, let's say 770 pixels. So this is going to be both for tablets and for mobile devices. For that, we are going to give it a container, a margin of 0, and then 10% of left and right. And we are going to make the image 100%. So image width is going to be 100%. That's it. Let's see what else can we style and how it looks right now. So if we go back, everything's good. On the mobile devices, that's good. The image is now, we have some paddings on left and right, and we also have the image right there, which is taking full width. Great. Let's now add some space between these cards. So that can be done into the cards.module.css. And we need to specify simply a margin. So we're going to do the same thing. We are going to copy the media from right there. And we are going to say simply that card margin 2%. So that's on top and bottom, and 0 on left and right. And unfortunately, we need to say important because this is a material UI element. If we do that and we go back, you can see we have some slight little padding right here. What else can we do? We can make the chart a bit bigger on mobile devices. So we can do that in the chart.module.css. Again, copy the media query, and inside of here, we're going to make that container span 100% of the width. So if we go back and refresh, now we can see the chart is just a bit bigger. It doesn't look all that good on mobile devices, but if we make it landscape, it looks good. So we have that for mobile devices. Tablet also looks great. And our basic version, let's refresh to see those numbers counting up. Hopefully more recoveries are going to be here. But yeah, in here we get our chart. Let's see for Andorra, for example. This is a bar chart that we were expecting. Bahamas, okay, works well. I just noticed one small issue that we have. So if we go to the country picker and choose a country, for example, Australia, and then if we go back to the global, take a look at what happens. We get an error and it says cannot get API countries global. What does this mean? That means that if we go to the country picker, we shouldn't set the value for global to be global. We just need an empty string because there is no country chosen. And then for that case, if the global is chosen, this country is going to be an empty string. We're going to just fetch data for an empty string. And in the API, since we know that empty string is a falsy value, if there is an empty string, still our basic API for daily data is going to be called, and then we're going to get our basic historic daily chart other than this bar chart. So one more time, we go to Angola and then we get back to global. And this time we indeed do get the proper chart. That's it. Our application is done. Since I was recording this video, there may be some mistakes in the code. So what I would strongly encourage is that you go to the GitHub, link is down below. And then if you want to use this project or even make it better, just fork the repository of this project. While you're there, you can also give it a star on GitHub. If you like this video, feel free to subscribe and leave a like. That really helps a lot with YouTube algorithm. Also, if you'd like more complex projects like MERN Stack or more complicated Redux or React applications, feel free to let me know in the comments. Also, let me know what you think about this Corona tracker. Now we are going to go over the whole application one more time so we can repeat what we learned and what we built. Starting from the app.js, it's the only class-based component that we have. In here, we have the data and the country, which are just some initial states. There we have the component didMount, which is making a request to the fetch data. The fetch data is in the API, so we are creating a special fetch data function, which is asynchronous. That function is returning right there only the data that we need. Now, once we get that data, we are setting it to the state. Sometimes we are also going to be able to choose a country. So how do we do that? If you go into the components and then the country picker, you'll be able to see that there we have our country picker component, and it works using the form control and the native select from Material UI. There we are fetching the countries right here. We are fetching them from the API. It's just an array of 180 countries. And then we don't have to write option 180 times. We are just looping over them, and then we'll be able to choose from all the countries. Once the country is chosen, it goes back to the app.js right here through this handle country change. There we get the country as a parameter, and we are making a request one more time to the fetch data API. This time with the fetch data, it also changes the country. In here, we are of course displaying the image, the cards, the country picker, and the chart. So cards are always being shown and the data is being fetched right here in the app. But for the chart, the data is sometimes being fetched from the Charts.js itself. And that's on our initial load. In Charts.js, the data is being fetched right here. So that's fetch daily data. That's completely different data coming from the API. It's historic daily data. So we need that data only to show this line chart. We loop over the data and we display this line chart, which is using the React Charts.js 2. After we do that, we then display it right here. But when we choose the country, then we don't have the array of all the different days of the data. We just have the current data. So we just have one number, and that is again coming from the API right here. Then again, we have the cards, which are the crucial part of that. In here, we have the count up component, which we'll learn how to use. We are also getting all the data coming from props from the app, which is using the API. And then we are rendering 3 different cards showing the current data in this count up component. We mentioned that we may want to refactor this because we have a lot of repetitive code, but since this video is already too long, you can do that yourself. So you need to create a map and then an array with all different data. So you're going to loop through 3 objects. First one is going to have data like infected, the data for the infected, this little string right there, number of active cases, and then the second object in the array is going to have recovered, number of recoveries, recovered value. You're going to loop over that and then display the same thing 3 times. So that would be one optimization that we could make. Finally, in here we have all the APIs, fetching the data, fetching the daily data, and then fetching countries. Of course, all of this, as always on JavaScript Mastery, is done on the newest JavaScript standards. We are using async await. We are using the proper React folder structure and the files. We are exporting all the components from only one file. Everything is just up to date and ready to show, for example, to your employers or just to showcase on your portfolio. That's going to be it for this video. See you in the next one.